The glass tower of London rose into the morning haze like a monument to arrogance. Inside its highest chamber, the boardroom gleamed with polished marble floors and windows that stretched into clouds. The hum of the city below was muted, replaced by the steady clicking of pens, the faint shuffle of paper, and the low murmur of executives in expensive suits. Silver trays of coffee and pastries lined the table, untouched, as though the ritual of wealth itself required no sustenance. At the far end of the long oak table sat Ibrahim Traoré. His uniform was simple, military fatigues pressed, boots polished, his posture steady as stone. He did not fidget. He did not smile. His eyes were sharp, reflecting not the glitter of chandeliers but the weight of a continent that had been underestimated for generations. The room around him was not quiet. It was filled with a particular sound, the laughter of men who believed they would always be in command. One director, his cufflinks catching the light, leaned back and dismissed a proposal placed before him. "A gold-backed system," he sneered, his tone dripping with amusement. "You think we would tie Europe's future to a jungle economy?" The others chuckled, their voices rising like smoke that stings the eyes. Traoré did not answer. He simply watched, his silence heavy, his stillness unsettling. In his palm rested a single device, a secure line waiting for a signal. His thumb hovered near the command that would ripple across borders and oceans. Outside, in distant deserts and savannas, convoys of trucks loaded with gold sat idle, waiting for a word that had not yet been spoken. The laughter continued, but the room itself seemed to darken. The air thickened with a storm no one could see. Traoré finally shifted, his jaw tightening as a mockery echoed off the glass walls. What none of them realized, what none of them could even imagine, was that in 5 minutes their empire of balance sheets and reserve would begin to fracture. Their polished windows would no longer reflect power, but panic. The silence of one man was about to drown out the noise of an entire continent. The laughter had scarcely faded when the first vibration rattled the director's phone. He glanced at the screen with irritation, then frowned. One alert, then another, then a cascade of red banners spread across his display. His fingers shook as he tried to refresh the data, but the numbers refused to move. Across the table, a younger analyst leaned close to whisper, his face pale as parchment. "So, it is not just Burkina Faso. Mali and Guinea have joined. Niger as well. Every route from the Sahel has gone dark." The color drained from the director's cheeks. He looked at Traoré, who sat unblinking, hands folded neatly, as if the chaos unfolding around them were a storm he had charted long before. Screens on the wall erupted with breaking headlines. African gold halted. Markets braced for shortages. Central banks on alert. Traders in Frankfurt shouted into phones, their voices cracking with fear. In Zurich, entire dashboard froze, unable to process contracts tied to West African reserves. By midday, billions in gold-backed securities were tumbling. The executives in the room shifted uneasily, their polished arrogance dissolving into disbelief. One muttered under his breath, "This cannot be real. He has no allies." But a voice at the far end, hushed yet sharp, replied, "We gave him the power ourselves, decades ago. We assumed he would never use it." The silence that followed was colder than any insult. Beyond the walls, the ripple was no longer just financial. Diplomats scrambled, summoning emergency sessions. In Brussels, officials demanded explanations. Some whispered of foreign interference, that China had guided his hand, that Moscow had fueled his defiance. Others spoke of betrayal, that Europe had for too long taken Africa's silence as consent. Outside on the streets, electronic tickers flashed in blood-red letters. EU markets plummet after African strike. Crowds gathered, murmuring in disbelief. Pensioners clutched newspapers predicting collapse. Meanwhile, in Bamako and Conakry, children carried banners scrawled with the words, "Our gold, our future," waving them through dancing streets. Back inside the tower, the director who had mocked Traoré now leaned forward, his voice trembling. "What is it you want? Money? Concessions? Trade terms?" Traoré rose slowly. His eyes swept the room, not in anger, but in judgment. He spoke for the first time since pressing send. "You called it a jungle, yet your vaults feed on its veins. When the jungle reclaims what is its own, tell me, what will your empire breathe on?" He turned toward the elevator, his boots echoing against the marble, each step a drumbeat of inevitability. The doors closed behind him. In his wake, panic tightened its grip on Europe. What began as arrogance was becoming an unraveling. The empire was crumbling, not with guns, not with blood, but with silence, dignity, and a reckoning they never prepared for. Far from the glass towers of London, the night in Ouagadougou was heavy with heat and silence. The streets of the capital were restless with celebration, but inside the presidential residence, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone on a rooftop balcony, his silhouette outlined against a horizon of flickering lights. The wind carried distant chants of joy, yet his face remained motionless, carved with a burden of command. He pressed his palms against the railing, not in triumph, but in contemplation. He had pulled a lever that shook Europe, yet in his chest the weight did not feel like victory. It felt like inheritance, an unfinished history he had been forced to carry. Images flooded his mind. The hands of miners scarred from years of digging, elders who had whispered stories of colonial theft, children staring at blackboards with no chalk. They were the reason he acted. Yet he wondered if they would also be the ones to suffer if retaliation came. The generals believed in his strategy. The ministers cheered his defiance. But in the quiet hours, he heard another voice, the voice of fear. It asked whether he had risked too much. What if the embargo brought hunger before it brought dignity? What if the same people who danced tonight cursed his name tomorrow? He closed his eyes, and the sound of European laughter from the boardroom returned to him. That laughter was not just dismissal. It was centuries of dismissal. It was every treaty signed in a language not their own, every coin extracted without a school being built, every village left barren while vaults across the sea overflowed. His loyalty to his people battled with his loyalty to survival. Should he bow for stability or stand for justice? His ancestors had endured chains, humiliation, and silence. He could not accept that their descendants would endure the same under different names. Still, the question lingered like smoke. How many sacrifices would it take to make dignity real? A voice broke the stillness. His advisor approached carefully, carrying a tablet filled with reports. So, European leaders are calling emergency summits. Sanctions are being discussed. They believe you will yield. Traoré did not turn. He kept his gaze on the horizon, where the lights of the city glimmered like fragile stars. His reply was steady, though his chest carried the ache of solitude. They think I am playing a game of power. But this is not power. This is memory. This is heritage refusing to bow again. The advisor hesitated, then asked softly, "And what are the costs, sir?" Traoré finally looked away from the city and toward the dark sky. His answer was quiet, almost whispered, yet it carried the weight of a vow. The cost of freedom will always be high, but the cost of forgetting we deserve it is far greater. The camera lingered on his expression, torn, human, unyielding. Behind him, fireworks lit the streets in celebration. Ahead of him, unseen storms gathered, waiting to strike. By dawn, the echo of Traoré's silent strike had rippled far beyond Ouagadougou streets. Radios crackled in remote villages, announcing the embargo with voices that trembled between disbelief and joy. In markets across Mali and Niger, vendors painted their stall with slogans, "Our well stays here." Children carried makeshift banners fashioned from scraps of cloth, declaring a future they had never seen but now dared to imagine. In Bamako, crowds filled public squares with music and drums. Fireworks exploded not for a holiday, but for dignity reclaimed. Old men wiped tears as they spoke of a day they had thought would never come. Across the Sahel, villagers said the same phrase again and again. "He gave us back our gold." Thousands of miles away, the mood was different. In Brussels, the European Commission convened under emergency lights, faces drawn and weary. Ministers barked at one another across the long table, blaming negligence, blaming arrogance, blaming the blindness that had allowed such leverage to grow unnoticed. France demanded swift punishment. Germany urged caution. Smaller nations whispered about compromise, terrified of watching their reserves turn into quicksand. Television anchors across Europe struggled to maintain composure. Screens displayed plunging indices while headlines flashed with words that had not been uttered in decades: collapse, default, shock. Newspapers scrambled for metaphors to explain the unraveling. Some called it economic sabotage. Others dared to name it justice. In New York, the financial press spoke in clipped tones. Analysts admitted that nearly half of Europe's gold-backed loans were exposed to the Sahel. Investors who once ignored Africa now studied every headline from Ouagadougou with clenched jaws. Traders muttered the same stunned confession. We never imagined they would say no. Meanwhile, global South capitals responded with fire. In Nairobi, murals appeared overnight, gold coins painted as suns rising behind the outline of the continent. In Caracas, a news anchor declared that Africa had done with silence what others had failed to do with war. From Sao Paulo to Jakarta, commentators hailed Traoré as a figure who had forced the world to remember that resources are not favors but birthrights. Social media magnified the divide. Across Africa, posts surged with optimism. #Jungle No More, #Gold Strike. Young people remixed Traoré's boardroom silence into videos that spread faster than any speech. In Europe, the same clip circulated with dread, framed as a warning of markets slipping beyond control. Pride at home grew louder, while panic abroad deepened. And in the middle of it all, diplomats whispered in corridors from Washington to Beijing. Some plotted to isolate Burkina Faso. Others calculated how quickly they could pivot to secure their own share of Africa's rising alliance. The world had shifted in a single night. For the first time in living memory, Europe was not dictating terms. It was reacting. And every move it made seemed too slow against a silence that had already spoken louder than words. As governments scrambled and markets swayed, a different storm broke quietly, hidden not in trading floors, but in archives. Weeks earlier, before the boardroom confrontation, Traoré had walked unannounced into the Ministry of Mines in Ouagadougou. He descended into a dusty records chamber where shelves sagged under forgotten ledgers. No entourage, no cameras. Only a young archivist guiding him through papers that smelled of dust and age. There, among yellowing contracts, he discovered signatures that were not Burkina. Corporations with no offices on the continent, registered under shell names in Luxembourg and Jersey, had been siphoning billions in undeclared exports for decades. Pages showed licenses valid for 99 years, agreements written in languages no villager could read. Some companies no longer even existed, yet the flow of gold had continued under their names. The realization cut deeper than any insult. It was not mismanagement. It was theft designed to look legitimate. He called it the silent looting. Back in the present, the truth was no longer confined to those basement shelves. A leak exploded across African media, a dossier tracing the shadow trail of gold that Europe had hidden in offshore havens. Numbers were staggering, over $16 billion in wealth drained in less than 20 years. Enough to build schools, hospitals, roads across the entire Sahel. The revelation did not simply anger the public. It lit a fire. In Bamako, protesters carried photocopies of the documents, waving them in the streets like proof of betrayal. In Niamey, university students read aloud the names of foreign firms that had disguised plunder as partnership. #silent looting climbed to the top of African social feeds, spreading across borders with ferocity. But the leak held another shock: coordination. The document revealed secret meetings between Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea months before the embargo. Encryption networks had been set in place. Legal task forces had mapped colonial-era treaties line by line. What the world dismissed as a reckless move was in fact the product of meticulous preparation. In Brussels, panic turned into humiliation. A Belgian banker confessed to colleagues, "We monitored ships and trucks, but we never monitored will." And yet, the revelation carried one more twist. Among the signatures on those fraudulent contracts lay familiar names, not only European financiers, but also African officials long believed to be loyal to their people. Betrayal had not only come from abroad, it had festered within. Some ministers had quietly signed away futures for personal gain. When this became public, crowds outside Parliament buildings demanded trials. Murals once painted in celebration now carried slogans against traitors. Traoré himself addressed the matter in private council. They thought dignity cannot read, but dignity has read every page. Now the people know who sold their tomorrow. That night, an encrypted message reached his desk. It came from Nairobi, endorsed by leaders in South Africa and Egypt. They wished to join the embargo, not only as partners, but as architect of a new continental framework. What began as silence in one boardroom was becoming the foundation of something greater, a network of nations willing to write rules on their own soil. The revelation was no longer about one man's defiance. It was about an entire continent's memory awakening. Night fell over Ouagadougou like a heavy curtain, but the city refused to sleep. From rooftops and alleyways, from courtyards and dusty fields, people gathered around radios, projectors, and flickering screens. They waited, not for markets or for bankers, but for their own leader's voice. Inside a modest hall, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a blackboard, not a podium. Rows of schoolchildren sat on wooden benches, their eyes wide, their hands folded in silence. There were no diplomats, no wealthy sponsors, no velvet drapes, only chalk dust in the air and the weight of history in the room. He picked up a stick of chalk and wrote a single word in block letters, KURA. He turned slowly to the children. This, he said, his voice steady, is not only a name, it is a promise. KURA will be the first currency tied to our own reserves, guided by our own people, measured by our own dignity. Every coin will be worth more than metal. It will be worth memory. The children did not fully understand the economics, but they understood the moment. A girl in the front row whispered to the boy beside her, "It means our gold stays home." The hall erupted with applause, not from politicians, but from the young who would inherit the tomorrow he spoke of. Outside, the crowd that had gathered beyond the doors broke into song, a chorus of voices carrying into the night sky. Women danced with torches, elders beat drums carved generations ago, and the streets pulsed with a rhythm that no market collapse could silence. Meanwhile, across Europe, television screens showed the same image, a soldier president writing on a chalkboard as though teaching a lesson to the world. Commentators spoke of markets, of risk, of damage. But to those watching from Africa, the image meant something else. It meant the classroom had become the throne. As the noise swelled outside, Traoré placed the chalk back on the ledge and looked at the children. His final words were quiet, almost like a prayer. They believed our value belonged to them. Tonight, you must believe it belongs to you. The camera pulled back through the open window, away from the blackboard, away from the children, rising into the star-flecked sky. The chants of celebration blended with the hum of a continent awakening. And in that rising sound, one truth lingered. The empire that had mocked a man into silence was now forced to listen, because silence had become a new language of power. The story did not close with victory or defeat. It closed with a vow carried in children's voices, in drums on the streets, in the word written on the board.